And it's especially my pleasure to introduce our panel participants today. John Derf Backderf is an Ohio native who studied journalism at The Ohio State University and began his career as a political cartoonist at the student paper The Lantern. In 1990, he began The City, his comic strip for alt-weekly newspapers, which lasted for 24 years and at its height was carried in almost 150 papers. When these papers began to fail, Derf shifted into graphic novels, including Punk Rock and Trailer Parks, 2009, My Friend Dahmer, 2012, adapted into a movie in 2017, Trashed, 2016, and his Kent State, 4 Dead in Ohio in 2020. He's working on a yet undisclosed new book. Shelly Bond was an editor at DC Comics' Vertigo imprint from 1992 to 2016, working with such talents as Mike Allred, Neil Gaiman, Paul Pope, and Grant Morrison. Her current project is Off Register Press, a company co-founded with her husband Philip Bond, where Shelly edits and assembles crowd-funded anthologies, including 2 books that reflect her love of music. Heavy Rotation, 2021, about her experiences and the experience of friends as college radio DJs in the mid-1980s, and Fast Times in Comic Book Editing, 2023, about her early days at Vertigo and in New York City. Raeghan Buchanan was born in Pennsylvania and currently lives here in Columbus. She takes inspiration from DIY forms of punk expression, zines, gig posters, handwritten fonts, and explores the extensive but too often ignored participation of people of color in the history of rock and punk music. Her books include Strange Glances, an assemblage of illustrated quotes from musicians, artists, and activists inspired by punk rock, and The Secret History of Black Punk, Record Zero. Premiering here at CXC do you pronounce it Poctober or POC-tober?
Oh, we do both.
Oh, okay, there you go. Sketchbook issue number 2. And then finally, in his teens, Nate Powell self-published comics and became a founding member of the Little Rock punk band Sufi Nun Squad. And in the early 2000s, he brought his energies to graphic novels, writing and drawing Swallow Me Whole, The Silence of Our Friends in 2012, Save It for Later, 2021, and others. His 3-book collaboration with John Lewis and Andrew Iden, The March Trilogy, 2013 to 2016, won the National Book Award. Coming in early 2024's Fall Through, an, quote, interdimensional 1990s punk soap opera featuring Diamond Mine, a band that first appeared in his 2018 book, Come Again. And of course, doing the slides in a timely fashion was apparently past me. So here's a sample of everyone's work as we buzz through these slides. So I want to begin with a question for everybody on the panel. There are many ways to define the word punk. It's a music style, it's a fashion style, it's a set of political practices that prioritize mutual aid and communal alternatives to capitalism. But I'd like each of you to exemplify punk rather than define it by answering the following question. What's the most punk thing you ever did in your life? Or at least the most punk thing you've done that you're willing to reveal to the audience here at CXC. I know that's an odd question, but...
Nothing work?
Yeah, right. Crickets.
Do we just answer when we want to answer?
Sure. There's no set rules for who gets to answer
I
first
didn't know
or whatever.
if it was like going in a row.
No.
No rules because it's like punk rules.
Just dive in. That's all right.
I can jump in. I feel like I grew up in a very thriving punk world in the 90s that appeared very unpunk to more established scenes, and so I feel like I had a pretty unpunk existence, but a lot of it was like, there we go. All right. I don't know, I'd say developing a cultural habit within my community for working together in teams of young people to find and map every single swimming pool in the city of Little Rock, and to spend 7 years breaking into these swimming pools 4 nights a week with independent watch crews and alarm systems, and all of it was just to swim and have a good time. But to me, the essence of punk is consecrating a free space, a liberated space that can be redefined or whatever. And so I'm going to choose the quirky angle here and being liberating 12 different swimming pools from different weird, like, froofy neighborhoods throughout the Little Rock suburbs, and then holding it down as a secret for 7 years was fairly punk.
But the word finally got out after 7 years?
The word did get out, yeah.
Anyone else in the panel want to answer? Go ahead, Shelly.
I'm going to just say making comics my way, despite the odds, and despite lots of other people saying no.
Does giving Jeffrey Dahmer rides home from school count? I really can't
retrospectively,
top
yeah.
that.
All right. Raeghan, did you have one you wanted to chime in with? Or?
I just wanted to say, I had a band that that was our thing, breaking into swimming pools.
Yes.
So it was like really cool. Like every place we went, we would just break into the swimming pool and like swim at night. It was really fun. I'm not sure. Like, I feel like my story is that there's a lot more Black people in punk rock visibly now in every scene, but the story is like a little while back that there were only 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 Black punks in your own personal scene or whatever. And for me, I tried to be very vocal within the punk scenes that I was in about what you shouldn't be saying to people, how you shouldn't be treating people, and know this is not like a punk rock like free for all where you can disrespect everybody. Like everybody's allowed to do what they want or whatever, but like I tried to make it so if you were around me or whatever, and I failed. But I think I was unpopular at times because of it or whatever, and so I would say probably that is maybe the most. I'm not sure.
But you were unpopular doing the right thing.
What?
You were unpopular doing the right thing.
I was a buzzkill for some people or whatever. When people want to say whatever they want to say, but.
All right. Thank you.
Everybody needs a buzzkill.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
any culture or microculture needs the buzzkill elements.
Listen, I was having fun. So, oh well.
That's a great name. That would be a great name for a punk band, Buzzkill Elvis.
The Buzzkill Elders. Well, one of the things that you
Feel
mentioned,
free.
Raeghan, was the idea of a scene, and I wanted to ask everybody about the scenes that they came out of. So, for example, Derf, you put a disclaimer in your book, Punk Rock and Trailer Parks, stating that the book is fiction, but you also set many of the book scenes in Akron, Ohio's legendary punk bar, The Bank. Did you hang out at the real life, The Bank?
Yeah, I was hanging out at the bank when I was a garbage man, actually, after I dropped out of college, which I guess is pretty punk too. It was an old bank in Akron back when the city collapsed, like all the cities in Ohio collapsed in the 70s, and this empty bank they turned into a punk club, which is awesome, right? I mean, what could better encapsulate failed capitalism than turning a bank into a punk club? And it had the vault and everything. They kept the booze in the vault and built the bar around it, and it was all mahogany and marble. It was awesome, and there were
Did you see Klaus Nomi at the
I
Bank?
did see Klaus Nomi there. Yeah, I saw the Dead Boys there too,
Wow.
and the Pagans. Northeast Ohio, Cleveland and Akron is huge in the annals of punk rock. I mean, it's as important as anywhere. Detroit or even New York. I mean, the people that it produced were really incredible. Yeah, it was a real buzz. It was a thrill, and I tried to eventually take that vibe and get it into my comics. It just took me a while.
You also mentioned yesterday to me that you went to a lot of punk bars when you finally came to OSU.
Yeah. I mean, I showed up here in '79, fall '79, so that was right at the peak of it. So I was hanging out at Crazy Mamas and Stashes and Mr. Brown's, seeing all the bands that came through. I got hit by a chair at a Ramones concert. I was part of the riot at the Plasmatic show and almost got arrested by.
Wait, you were at the riot where the cop, like that one that you were kind of referring to in your comic?
That was in Cleveland, actually, but that concert that I depict where she got arrested. But I was at the next concert, which was full of cops, because Columbus. and Columbus Cops. And yeah, I had a wrestling match with a cop over my camera because I was shooting it for the Lantern. And I shot him beating up a kid because cops were getting pissed off because she was flipping him off from the stage.
Wow.
Man, it was awesome. It was like just really an incredible evening.
Raeghan, your birth town of Erie, Pennsylvania, has a pretty unexpectedly rich scene of punk and alt shows, many of which these days are hosted by the all-ages art and music space Basement Transmissions. What was the music scene like in Erie when you were discovering punk?
So when I was discovering punk, I was like very young, and so it was kind of through my brothers, and I didn't go to shows. I wasn't part of a scene. I was a very overprotected child. I didn't really know of other punks when I was like young. I feel like I kind of was a more part of a scene when I was in Pittsburgh. I worked, I was in South Carson. Both my brothers live in Pittsburgh, so I would kind of just couch surf between their homes. At one point, I was working on the same street where I was like, they lived across the street from each other, and like where I was living, and then I would kind of get off of work and go to the different bars. There was a Smiling Moose, D's, the White Eagle After Hours Club, and so that was kind of probably the first time where I felt like I was not necessarily part of a scene in that I was like playing in bands. I wasn't in any bands yet,
Right.
but I was seeing shows every other day. I think, yeah, in Erie, I kind of didn't really have like a crew. I was just listening to tapes by myself. My friends didn't like listen to punk rock. They didn't like make fun of me for listening to it, but they didn't listen to it at all.
Right, so it wasn't a scene. Or
Not for me. There was a scene and somebody else could talk about it, but it's just not me.
I was going to ask that, and I'll ask this specifically about Pittsburgh, which is where you seem to have really connect with people who were listening to the music. What were some of the local bands and personalities in Pittsburgh that inspired you to become a drummer and an artist?
Well, I was always an artist, but the bands that inspired me to become a drummer, I wanted to be Bill Stevenson from The Descendants, they're not from Pittsburgh, and that was a hard idol to choose to try to be like in starting out drums. But my brother was in a band called Submachine. That was like a very long-running band. I guess they just broke up last week, or last month. And then there was Thin White Line, which I have in my book with Bobby Porter, Os Rotten, Caustic Christ, bands like that were from Pittsburgh. So those are probably kind of in the vein of the bands, hardcore bands that were my inspiration to. A lot of the bands in Pittsburgh that I knew were kind of more like socially conscious or like leaned more political, I guess, than as opposed to like, party punk or just, yeah.
No, that's fine.
Did I answer the question?
Yeah, no, it absolutely did. And that's an interesting distinction that you draw between party punk and, because...
Yeah, I don't.
like
That's
said,
not an actual genre. I'm sorry I said that,
No,
but
no. That's okay. Nate, I'll ask you about scenes now. You're obviously from the Little Rock scene, and you were involved with Sufi Nun Squad for a long time. You were one of the founding members. And you also said that much of your early life was built around the assumption that everything that you did had to be structured around your participation in the band. What did you learn about yourself and your creativity while you were with Sufi Nun Squad? I mean, you're always with them, but you know what I mean, active. And
So we started Sufi Nun Squad the same month that I published my first comic in like September '92, and the person I collaborated with on our first comic series was the other singer in Sufi Nun Squad. So and his little brother, who also drew some stories that we self-published, was the drummer of the band. All of this was really, really intermingled. I'd say it wasn't until I started because like growing up in pre-internet Arkansas, to move back to the comics side of it, like I can't stress enough that I was not aware really of comics that weren't superhero or superpower based until I moved away to the East Coast for college. Like I knew about, through Ninja Turtles, I knew about Cerebus the Aardvark, and like through like Frank Miller and like some of the early 90s Dark Horse stuff that was going on. Like I had an awareness, but it wasn't until the late 90s when I finally like hit my stride with like how to make my own comics that had nothing to do with the superhero comics I didn't read anymore, where all of a sudden I'm like, oh, and I got much more serious about being in a band, which at this point like started as a 5-person band, and just eventually like we were basically the Muppet movie as a band, or maybe just the Muppet Show, but we had our membership could be anywhere between 6 and maybe like 12 people, and it was a very amorphous, very living, free space consecrating thing where whoever was there and was participating was a part of this thing that could not be contained or defined. But that as I got more serious about comics and more serious about Sufi at the same time, from a creative standpoint, I was like, oh, what a distinction here. I've discovered that I absolutely love making music with other people and kind of building something up collectively that does not belong to any one of us. And often we can't even pinpoint where ideas developed or emerged. And I also love making comics by my damn self and not having to answer to anyone and being able to do things that can't quite be understood outside of my bubble, but hoping they will, maybe as I become a better cartoonist. So I developed this very binary kind of creative dynamic where like I loved the solitude of comics and I loved the collectivist creative like vibrance of being in a band. So that's how I reconciled those things, and it allowed both of them to really thrive as totally separate things. Even while I was making art for the band, etc., they just kind of stayed in separate pockets.
And with different needs, right? Your need to be alone, your need to collaborate.
Without a doubt.
Yeah. This is a question for everybody in the panel, but I'll aim it at Shelly first. I first heard punk music myself in a shop that sold both comics and records, and this is fairly common. If the slides were working, I would show you a slide of Criminal Records in Atlanta being a good example. Mm-hmm. First off, did anybody discover punk or become deeper into punk or new wave music as a result of that? Mm-hmm. A shop like that? And also, more generally, do you see affinities between the music that you heard in the shops and the fact that they were selling comics?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, Shelly?
Monkey's Retreat. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay.
That's okay.
Sorry.
That's okay, Derf. You can totally go first.
No, you go ahead.
No, please, I insist.
You guys are too polite for a punk panel, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, Monkey's Retreat in Columbus. That's where I found. That's where I bought Punk Magazine. That's where I bought Raw and Weirdo and Love and Rockets and all that stuff. And I was like, wow, man, these are really great. They're so much better than the crap that I'm drawing. and because of, you try to just get your inspiration from all around you. And I was going to shows and I was reading this stuff, and I really wanted my work to reflect that, and it took a while to work that out. I mean, I was really young, but by the late 80s, or mid 80s, really, about 86, it finally kicked into gear, and suddenly I just said, fuck this other stuff, and I didn't even pretend to be mainstream anymore, and it just came out. And at that point, it's a real rush. It's like when that happens, when you find your voice, as Joe Strummer famously said, it's an incredible thing to be in the right place at the right time with the right shit. And when that happens, it's a rare gift.
I was the one who was going to bring up Joe Strummer. You and I talked about this yesterday.
No, you were the Mick Jones.
No,
you
I
were
was
the Mick
not.
Jones.
That is a lie. He wants to fight me. He's going to lose. Anyone who kind of knows me. I'm going to actually segue, though, because I do want to say, I grew up outside of Philadelphia in Reading, Pennsylvania, which was suburban hell. I called it Deading, PA. I was an hour and 6 minutes from Salvation because that's how long it took to get to Philadelphia. So to answer the question, I got into music long before I got into comics, and I got into cool music because no one else was listening to it. And when I was allowed to go to Philadelphia with a chaperone, I went to places like Zipperhead, which sold really cool clothes, had a couple of comics on the floor, and lots of cool records. But I have to say, one of the things I'll always remember is that on my 16th birthday, September 25th, 1982, The Clash were playing in Philadelphia, and I still hate my parents for not letting me go. I was certain I was going to meet Joe Strummer because he is one of my heroes, and we did talk about this yesterday. And one of the things I want to say about comics and music, they're my two favorite things. And I'm making comics the way I make comics now, with urgency, because of Joe Strummer, because he is the frontman who made me believe that anyone can do anything. You just have to have conviction, and you need to do things with intent. And punk is fast, and that's how comics should be made. Over to Derf again now.
I have met Joe Strummer,
What?
so I win this argument.
Shelly, let me piggyback on that observation that you just made. In Fast Times, in comic book editing, actually you describe yourself quite a bit as being as much new wave as you are punk. And I was wondering, even as, of course, here you are, that iconic shot of you with the boombox with the Clash sticker on it. But what differences, if any, if you see between the two terms? And I can open it up to other folks on the panel, too, if you see a difference historically between those two designations of punk and new wave.
You know what? That's a really difficult question to answer because I also consider myself to be a new romantic. And ultimately, I tie it together as saying I'm post-punk. I love postmodernism. I love deconstructing, and I love amalgamations of things. When I met Dame Darcy years ago, she called me a moth to my face. And I didn't even know what that was. It's a mod and a goth. So I have to say I have favorite bands, and I want it to be on record that I am a way bigger Strummer fan than Derf. I know I am.
So it's cosmically unfair that he got to meet him and you didn't, is that it?
Oh yeah,
I
for
can
sure.
I can live with that.
But the labels are cool, and I do like them. I'm not gonna lie. But I always think of punk as, rather than just like a musical era, I just think it's a way of life.
Does anybody else want to chime in on the differences between?
Yeah, I don't remember. The labels, New Wave was just kind of cooked up by the record companies to make it more palpable. But for those of us who were in this, listening to that stuff, it was all just new music. Didn't really, the labels, it didn't really matter. I mean, post-punk or punk or
Right.
all that stuff. It's just like, yeah, it's new. It's not playing on whatever the
AOR
I forget the
radio or
AOR
whatever.
radio station here. What the hell was it called? I can't remember. Which?
I went to college a couple years before you got
Okay.
But it was like
No, you don't know
album-oriented
either.
rock.
We've all forgotten, as it should be forgotten. But if it was new, it was new, and we were into it. So, or the, all the ska bands and all that stuff.
Sure.
I mean, I love those things.
But there was, from what, I've read, there was a little bit of, I agree, genres they're just words that people are putting into do little separation. You can't just call everything just music, or you'd be hard to find in the store or whatever. But, I think it's interesting, the fights that people would have in between themselves, the Black Flag, Kill Ant's Dead, when Adam Ant played.
Oh yeah, that California hardcore scene. They were mostly.
Yeah, they were like gangs. And
Most
stuff
like,
that.
well, more like wrestling team guys who were passing themselves off. Yeah, I wasn't really. There were a couple bands I liked from the West Coast, but for the most part, they were pretty obnoxious.
I generally concur with the vibe here in that, in a nutshell, punk is such an obvious misnomer, and yet we have words to use them. We have terms so that we can use them. But
I like saying new wave because it makes people upset a little bit.
yes, a
Sometimes
solid
they're
point.
like, what are you talking about? You like this kind of music. I'm like, no, it's good. You listen to Missing Persons. You'll love it. They don't like that.
How about how about no wave? I mean, then you go the other
Yeah,
direction.
That's even better.
I enjoy that, especially because punk in general is a subculture that is sort of like propped up and defined by 16 to 24-year-olds, even as middle-aged and now old people are still a part of its life and its legacy. We're still following the rules of
talking to me?
16-year-olds. So, but I like that it also means that these moments can be moments in punk history and in music or whatever can be just a couple of months long. Eras can be 2 or 3 years. So I like that there's a natural, living. There's a living nature to the culture itself, so that reactions and reactions upon reactions within a movement that create these splintered, creative subgenres and approaches are things that happen at such a rapid clip that they're almost always over by the time a term is settled on to refer to them. And I think it's kind of cool that all of those terms are basically dead terms.
Defunct, yeah.
Well, they didn't right? Punk wasn't a term that a lot of people liked or that certain people would accept or whatever, right? It was made up by someone, like a critic,
Legs McNeil.
Yeah, but considered a critic, right? And it wasn't something that everybody wanted to be called or anything like that. I think it's like what you said about, I like it how it's kind of like hip hop, where it's in our time. We are seeing people are still alive that were in the beginning of it. So we're seeing the graduation of it or whatever. Yes. It's just a cool era. And you're right, because, I always think so punk was 2 years, really, right? And
No,
Even-
longer than that. No, it was longer than that. Yeah, I never bought that. It was 1 year, 1977.
No.
It was still going on. No,
Well, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is in a lot of people do consider it over by 79, and everything after that is sort of reverberating out from that. But I feel and again, I mean, I'm 40, so that's where I am in the scheme of punk or whatever. But that's kind of what I've read people would consider. But to me, it feels like something that happened in people's neighborhoods or whatever that somehow got out. This could have happened and no one ever paid attention to it or whatever. So I think some of the things that I read are coming from those people who felt well, this is something we did or whatever.
Right.
It's whatever, how everybody else feels, but.
More rooted rather than from coming up rather than.
I don't think that you can talk about anything in punk rock and have people agree on it, to be honest.
Yeah, that's probably right.
I mean, the obsession with labels, it's it's like comics. I mean, we're really label obsessive in comics too, and I don't really, people cross over and they don't fit in certain labels anymore. And I can say that as the world's biggest Joe Strummer fan, by the way. I think I have the voice of authority in this.
Excuse me?
We touched a little bit on radio, so I wanted to talk about that a little bit. Radio? Shelly, I didn't ask you about your venue, because I think your venue that was so revelatory for you when you were younger was doing the DJ shift at WICB Radio in Ithaca College, right?
That is true. So I couldn't wait to leave my hometown and get out of state. And I wanted to go to New York City. And my father said, no, you will not. So I went to upstate New York instead. And fortunately for me, I met my tribe at the radio station. I was a film major. I did production, audio and video production. I was an editor, which, yay, translated to comic book editing like that. God, it was just a great fit. But I loved being a college DJ. And just to kind of go back to a point everyone made, our college radio station was called new music or alternative, because that was the name of the time. So I was in college from 1984 to 1988, and it was all about being new music, which I thought was lame. We were all about the music that wasn't like, top 40 AOR radio. And it was liberating on every level. So Heavy Rotation is a book I put together. In 2021, we were all exhausted by Remember the Pandemic. And I always loved to combine music and comics my whole life. So I thought, let me get real. Let me reach out to some of my fellow former DJ friends from college. And by the way, there's a reason why they're not still your best friends, but whatever. I got writers in quotes. They didn't always like my red pen, but I got them to collaborate with some artists who I've befriended or know in the industry. And we did put together a love letter to college DJs of the 80s. So that's Heavy Rotation. But yeah, we always had those arguments about punk and new wave and, it was just always a part of being interested in music, and no one ever agrees, but everyone agrees that I'm the biggest Joe Strummer fan.
I asked Joe about that, and he never heard of you.
Au contraire. I wrote Joe many a fan letter when I was 16.
16 fan letters?
No, when I was
when you were
16, I
I'm
started
sorry.
writing Joe fan letters.
I wanted to extend that question to everybody else and ask you what kind of role radio, either your own participation as DJs or listening to radio, had to do with your involvement in the music.
Well, funny you should ask that. Yeah, so grew up in Little Rock, a small to mid-sized city, and a year or so before I got into punk, I got into thrash metal. We Living Sacrifice, this Christian thrash death metal band that got kind of big around the year 2000, was our big hometown band. So I was aware of some sense of D.I.Y. stuff right on the cusp of punk. But what really made everything explode was getting into punk the month that Nevermind came out, but entirely independent of the existence of Nevermind. This is where I was born in 78, and so the more I look back on life, the more I see August, September 91 as a dividing line in a lot of sub cultural existence. But it was also in that month that our community radio station, KBF, which had a couple of 3 a.m. on a Tuesday night punk shows, finally the punk children got a Friday night 10 p.m. spot called Adios America, and that was it. And so being a metal kid who had, there were these weird other kids around who were slightly older, and all of a sudden I was oh, that's what these weird kids are. That's what's going on. And I remember just being oh yeah, you gotta listen to the show Adios America, quote, it plays punk music from all over the world. And it's important to mention that because I had never conceived of their, besides the fact that obviously growing up with MTV bands and stuff, there are lots of European bands and stuff that you wind up seeing and hearing or whatever. But it had never occurred to me that there was a way to get bands from all over the world who are making this weird kind of music with weird ideas and somehow get it broadcast onto a tiny radio station in Arkansas. And so a lot of that just Adios America was the local crystallizing element. Little Rock had a really thriving scene already, but it helped actually become a news broadcasting source. It helped people, it helped 14-year-olds be able to find their way to a show. Everything really converged in this highly specific way. And my scene was there was only one venue that actually had a stage or a bar, and most shows were not there. I grew up in a scene that had no venues, no stages, nothing. The entire point was that it was on the floor level, in living rooms or in a park, pirated power, illegal, public. It developed a very weird demographic of people who were mashed up together that made Little Rock very special. But radio was the thing that actually allowed this filtration of all of these different forces to be aware of a secret thing.
That was the catalyst.
Yes.
Raeghan or Derf, did radio play a part in your own punk odyssey?
No, see, I'm gonna have to sit this one out because I'm from Erie, Pennsylvania. We have 4 channels, so we have 4 radio stations.
Well, I can. I started with WOSR, which was the campus radio station at Ohio State. You could only get on campus. If you were blocked off campus, you couldn't pick up the signal because Ohio State only cared about their classical music station, you know. So they kind of threw a bone to us to give us this, and that was great. And then when I moved to Cleveland, I mean, they had phenomenal college radio. Cleveland State and Case were both still going strong. And I would listen to that stuff as I was drawing, absolutely. And it absolutely started to filter into the work I was making. And the more I listened to that radio, the more crazy my work got. So yeah, it was very closely linked. You know, you're pulling things from around you.
Hey Derf, when I was a college DJ, I did a special show called Artist Only on The Clash.
Yeah?
Impressed yet?
No, when I asked Joe Strummer about it, he had never heard of that show. So
Shelly, he was hanging out with Joe Strummer talking about you, though.
You know, there you go, right?
And Artist Only, taken from a Talking Head song, right? Title?
Perhaps.
We're getting to the point where I'd like to leave about 10 minutes for questions from the audience, but one final thing I wanted to ask you is if there was any specific graphic artists associated with the punk movement that were an influence on you. I can quote a couple, like Raeghan, I read an interview with you where you said that Raymond Pettibon was incredibly important to you. Is that fair to say?
Yes, yeah, I really was inspired by Raymond Pettibon. I read somewhere like kind of recently that probably a lot of stuff that I've seen was not stuff that he had meant to be seen or whatever. The covers that he did for Black Flag were not something that he like did for Black Flag, that like it was just something that they like just found.
Cool.
Yeah. Raeghan's a villain.
that's on point for Black Flag.
Yeah. But
well, Raymond Pettibon is Greg Ginn's brother, right? So
yeah,
you probably just saw it at home.
I don't know.
Took it off the kitchen
I guess
table or
they're
something.
brothers. Yeah.
Yeah.
I heard they don't talk.
Oh.
But yeah. Also, honestly, like the first time I saw Jaime Hernandez work was from his brother was in a band called Dr. No, which was a nardcore band. And he did the logo for that. So I've like seen his work. He's an influence on me as well. I don't even know if you could tell who my influences are or whatever. But also another thing that was happening for me was like my big brother he lived in Pittsburgh when I was, he's 11 years older than me, and you know that's how I got into punk. And he would send me flyers home from Pittsburgh. So I was just taking inspiration from, you know, it's before the internet, it's what people show you, you know what I mean? If somebody doesn't expose you to this stuff, you might never see it. So I'm just seeing like all of these like, you know, and they used to use comic books, collage, you know, to collage for all these like posters and everything like that, and like seeing the stuff in his record collection. So I'm definitely also inspired by like, you know, tens of nameless like artists that like I won't ever know who, you know, they were, whatever.
But
that
inspiration.
Yeah, that aesthetic. Yeah.
And I think the Sonic Youth album cover for Goo, and so many album covers. I mean, I bought a record by The Fall and fell in love with the band, but I bought it because of the album art. And Love and Rockets was my gateway drug. I was not into superheroes at all, and I started reading Love and Rockets, and that was it. So, you know, the logo design and the content, I think, were so important and are still important. But yeah, the music connection is huge and fierce. And I have to say, Derf and I agreed on one thing, and it's about how much Punk magazine was critical and is loved by so many of us who consider our love for music and comics to be mutually exclusive, even though my love for Joe Strummer and his love for me is much more than his love for Derf.
I've also met Marquis Smith.
What?
My biggest is actually someone you probably wouldn't even imagine was very punk, but Linda Barry. She was my first big inspiration to really kind of wig out with comics, and her early stuff is the punkest stuff you've ever seen. It's really amazing, stylistically, design-wise. Just blew my mind. And I don't even know if she's ever done any like flyers or records or anything. But I discovered that stuff in Monkey's Retreat up by campus, and that was really my headquarters for everything. And then
I got a bunch of stuff from Monkey's Retreat.
Did you?
Too. Yeah, I got like my Search and Destroy big like.
Oh,
magazines,
nice.
stuff like- or
It was
Slash
probably the
magazines and
second
stuff.
store because they got booted out of their first one.
Oh, was there two?
Yeah.
Everything's gone now.
Yeah,
So-
that's
that
right.
store was awesome though. That's
Yeah,
where I got
no.
my Please Kill Me.
Yeah, it was a great
was Monkey's
store. It
Retreat.
was really foundational. And then you just walk down High Street and go to a dozen record stores,
Yeah.
and just, okay, I'll have that. I'll buy this Joe Strummer bootleg that Shelly doesn't have, and I'll just keep going down the street.
You have no idea about my record collection, by the way.
In my connections with like visual artists in punk, like on the local level, like fortunately, by the time I was self-publishing comics in '92, there were already these slightly older kids involved with punk who a lot of them were entering their 20s, but who had been making zines since about the mid 80s. Like the first cartoonist who was related to the underground in Little Rock was actually Matt Besser, like the comedian, the co-founder of Upright Citizens Brigade. He's from Little Rock. And so I think he published the first zine out of Little Rock too, Barking at Life. But he and this guy Bobby Matthews from the band Trusty, he was a cartoonist. This guy Ben Nichols, who was roughly my age, he's in this band Lucero that's still around today. He was a great cartoonist and still is. And so he was sort of the first person outside of my bandmate best friend where we're like, oh, Ben's doing this stuff too. And so we were sort of feeding off of each other because like both parties were coming from this place where it's still in the pecking order of coolness. Doing pen and ink comics was, in fact, not as cool as the other stuff. And so like we helped like support each other and be like, it's okay to do your weird comic. Yes, let's publish something together. And Aaron Comet Bus, I think, is like the biggest non-local influence on what I was doing at the time. Like best known as a writer, but an incredibly influential and powerful, mostly photocopy artist and screen printer. But a lot of the textural components that he was doing with Xerox machines were very influential as I started getting into like using toothbrush and using dry brush and all this stuff with my art. But importantly, like design-wise, like I came from what I would call the heart attack era of like, again, post Nevermind, where underground hardcore went really underground hardcore, and a lot of this community was bound together by this fanzine Heart Attack. And so a lot of the, using the much maligned term, a lot of the emo hardcore stuff that we were a part of thrived off of making simplistic factory records influenced design using office supplies and copier scams that were available. So like in my next book, Fall Through, one of my big homages to it all revolves around this 500 copies of a 7-inch that are made. And a lot of it is the discovery of this artist, Lynn Ward, possibly creator of the graphic novel, and the like weird kind of reverberations coming off of his woodcuts. And so I grew up, like one of our local bands put out a 7-inch called Fall Through, featuring chock full of minimalist Lynn Ward woodcuts from like Madman's Drum. Right. And it wasn't until maybe like 5 years ago or 7 years ago that I got those nice like reprints of all the Lynn Ward
the Library
stuff.
of America books.
Yeah,
right.
and like my soul actually like melted and reformed me completely when all of a sudden I was like, this is the fall through 7-inch. and I'm like, this connects everything to the invention of the graphic novel. And so a lot of the mystical nature of that and the circular nature went straight into, like I reverse engineered a plot to justify linking
That
all those
connection.
elements together again.
I think we have time for maybe just one or two questions. So, yeah, here we go. I'll just bring the microphone over to you.
Do any of you regret choosing comics as a profession?
I'm sorry.
Hell no.
No.
Who said that? Did you ask Dan Klaus that yesterday? What did you say again? Do you regret
Choosing comics as a profession.
Oh.
I definitely don't. I will say, like, I never thought I'd be able to like make a living as a cartoonist. Side note, I do make a living as a cartoonist. But until 2009, I was like, I know that I have to make comics. And if I have to, my other career was doing care and advocacy work for people with developmental disabilities. On many levels, I'm like, I'm perfectly happy doing this as my career for the rest of my life, now that I know I must make comics. So, like, this is what I've wanted to do since I was 11. So, like, I'm all good.
Yeah.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I've always made a living making comics in one form or another. So I'm one of the lucky ones. But remember, I also started as a garbage man, so there was no one would go but up.
Just one final question.
I use the term punk rock pretty loosely. Is there an artist, whether musical or visual, that you would label punk rock where they might not have labeled themselves that?
Wow.
Leonard Cohen.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Yeah, Leonard Cohen.
And you just really
Woody
you really
Guthrie.
opened a can of worms right here.
There are several in Raeghan's
Screaming
book.
Jay Hawkins.
You kind of expand the canon.
Yeah,
right? I
that's
mean, we've
another
got a
good
couple
one.
images up here, but
Oh, I use it loosely too. I think it's more important to. I think it's more important to talk about the things, and everybody else can decide whether they want to call it punk rock or not. There's a. This is probably not that question, but like, for example, there's the proto-punk band Death.
Yeah,
which-
from Detroit.
Oh, yeah.
They're great.
So the relationship that generally the relationship that Black people have towards the word punk is not like, it's not something you want to be called. It's not something you want to be labeled. Those are fighting words or whatever. So that's another aspect of it for me. Like, I don't think that the band Death. I think that they are happy that people have rediscovered them, and that they are getting attention and they've played around. So I think that they're excited to do that. But I think they sort of shy away from the term punk still. I think they're kind of like, I guess, if that's what we're calling it or whatever. But I think that to me, punk is just kind of like a sampling of like every other kind of music, which a lot of musical genres are. But like punk just, seems like a snatch and grab of everything else. So like you could label it rock and roll, you could label it lots of different things. So
maybe that's a good place to, I'm sorry,
I'm
Shelly, go
so
ahead.
sorry. I
One
was just
final
going to
comment.
say, I think of punk now as people who have the guts to really innovate. So I'll just say Roisin Murphy is my current favorite female front person, and she's just an extraordinary force of nature, not unlike how Bowie was in the early 70s, a performance artist. And she has killer pipes. She's just a brilliant performer. So to me, she's the epitome of my punk right now.
I'm going to throw this out for like a brilliant 2 years. Lil Jon's punk.
why does every like one who just comes over with the battle jackets, have the Os Rotten patch? Does anybody know the answer to that? I feel like they always have like an Os Rotten patch, like somebody who is in pop culture who has the vest on. Sorry, that was probably like just a random question.
All right, why don't we thank our participants in the panel, and